This story's not mine, but my uncle's. Please excuse any formatting issues, I'm on mobile. I've been wanting to post this story for some time, but haven't found the best r/. If another place is better applicable for the story, please let me know. I'll clarify that what I believe the story to be true, there's a lot of room for speculation. I'll start out with some background information. My uncle has been a marine biologist for the past 50 years. He is now in his 60s and has spent the last 25 years teaching marine biology at a university. His area of expertise has been the North and Mid-Atlantic Ocean. Growing up, every time he would visit him in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, he would tell us countless stories of the numerous deep-sea expeditions he participated in. Prior to his teaching years, he was primarily a researcher. Every single story was interesting and filled with wonder. The story I'm about to tell is the only one that has me questioning what is really out there in the deep ocean. For the sake of the story, I'll refer to my uncle as Uncle Jay, or just Jay to keep some semblance of anonymity. This story begins when Uncle Jay was getting ready to embark on an upcoming expedition to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The research vessel they would be traveling on was a medium-sized vessel about 80 meters long. One of those ships that has a crane, and it was crewed by maybe 20 men, and there was about 15 marine biologists of various specialties attending. It was early summertime in the 90s. I'm unsure on the exact date, and Uncle Jay was about 30 at the time. He said they could have had a better day for loading the vessel. The ocean was calm and the weather was beautiful. They'll be out at sea for the next month and a half, all weather forecast looking promising. Once the ship was loaded, they embarked on their journey. It took them approximately a week to reach the ridge. The primary goal of this expedition was examine and possibly identify new species of sea life in that region. Additionally, they wanted to examine how known species lived. They didn't have any submarines, so in order to find any new species, they had an intriguing plan. Using the crane on board the ship, they attached cow carcasses to the hook and lowered them into the water near the ocean floor. A few feet away from the hook was multiple cameras and lights to observe any sea life that might devour the carcass. Uncle Jay said they had about 10 carcasses. They would begin their journey in the northern portion, lower the carcasses into the water for a few days, and move south along the ridge, repeating this process. When the carcasses were lowered in the ship, would power down all engines and simply drift. If they drifted away from the ridge, they would power up and very slowly move back into position. Because this was a rather low-budget mission, the cameras on the hook didn't provide a live feed, and all footage was thoroughly examined after. That was about 48 hours of footage they had to sift through after each time they pulled up the hook. They had been at this for about a week, and had not made any new discoveries, but did gain valuable footage of rarely seen sea life consuming the cows. At this point in the story, Uncle Jay said everything was going according to plan. The seas were calm, and everyone on board was enjoying their time. They were onto their 5th cow carcass. It was about 5 p.m., and they hooked it up and lowered it into the water. This portion of the ridge was about 3,500 meters deep and was pushing the limit of how much cable they had on the crane. Now, for this mission, 2 of the marine biologists were required to monitor the crane and the location in relation to the ridge at all times. My uncle and another biologist drew the short straw and had to watch overnight. They would swap out around 9 a.m. Uncle Jay said it was an uneventful night. Him and the other biologists chatted all night and bounced different theories off each other. Around 7 a.m., just as the sun was rising, all was calm. Almost too calm, Jay remarked. They hadn't drifted off course throughout the night. The ocean was just like glass. Much of the crew was beginning to rise as well, but what happens next is a complete shock to everyone on board. It's important to note that the crane had been angled off the right side of the ship. All of a sudden, and very rapidly, the 80-meter-long vessel began listing to the right side. It was almost as if something grabbed the hook and began pulling it deeper. My uncle said the immediate panic he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He said it felt like the ship was going to capsize. They immediately sounded the ship's onboard alarm system to notify the crew of an emergency. Once they had their facilities in order, after the initial shock, my uncle ordered the other biologists to begin reeling in the crane. Since the cabling was so long, it would take about 20 minutes to completely reel in the line. The other biologists began to reel in the crane, but the winch was struggling and the ship was leaning more and more into the water. My uncle said that just as the water began to pour over the right side of the ship, it smacked back down to an upright position. He was sent flying into some containers. Many of the crew had begun to come out now as well. There was several injured on board, but nothing was life-threatening. Over the next 20 minutes, as the crane was still retracting the line, the crew assessed their injured and any damage to the ship. My uncle was ultimately uninjured despite being thrown around. He said waiting for the line to come up was the longest 20 minutes of his life. Everyone was in complete shock as to what just happened. 2 minutes of complete chaos, and now all was calm again. When the crane returned to the surface, the cow carcass was completely gone, and the large metal hook was slightly bent. A few of the cameras was missing, but thankfully not all. The cow carcass being completely gone was the most interesting part, as in every other case it was never gone completely. The vessel's captain made the decision to head back shortly after this incident, much to the disappointment of the biologist, including my uncle, who wanted to find out what could have caused this. However, several onboard generators were damaged in the impact, and they were essential to the ship's operation. So they had to return. My uncle believed it was because the CPT and ship's crew were terrified, and rightfully so. On the week-long journey back, the biologist examined over the footage to try to identify what caused this. The footage, by all accounts, was normal. There was the carcass about 10 meters off the sea floor, illuminated by the floodlights. Some small shrimp-like sea life was feasting on the cow, when all of a sudden the cameras went black. Not as in they stopped recording, but something was covering them. The timestamp showed it was the correct time of the incident. After 2 minutes, lights came back on, and they could see again. It wasn't much though, as an enormous amount of sediment was kicked up from the ocean floor and now enveloped the view of the camera. While they were able to rule out the hook getting sagged to the bottom, they were never able to see what caused this. And that's how the story ends. No answer or explanation. That was it. They returned to port and reported their findings, but to my knowledge, nothing ever came of it. My uncle has his theories for what have caused this, ranging from a hungry sperm whale to giant squid to some unknown massive sea creature. Whatever it was must have been huge in order to devour a complete cow carcass in under 2 minutes and nearly capsize an 80-meter research vessel. While this story is outlandish and hard to believe, I've no reason to disagree with it. My uncle has never told any story that was similar to this. This is the only one that comes close to sea monsters from the unknown. But it makes you think what could really be out there, lurking in the deep ocean. Edit. To clarify any confusion about the cow carcasses, I asked my uncle to elaborate. On board the ship was a refrigerated container that they stored the carcasses in. He couldn't remember exactly where they got them from, but thinks it was from a local dairy farm. Once the cows reached the end of their lifespan, they would sell them off to local butchers, etc. In this case, a group of marine biologists bought them. Retired paramedic story time. I should write a book about my paramedic days. I posted this in a different r/ and had quite the response. Thought I'd share it here. Retired paramedic here. Had a call on a very desolate stretch of road for a car sitting in the middle of the road, covered in blood. Of course it has to happen at 2 a.m. just like every horror story. We arrive on scene and find a new Camaro sitting in the middle of the road that had obviously been hit in an accident. Problem is, there's absolutely nothing else around the car. No persons, no other vehicles, nothing. Part of my job then was a tactical paramedic for our sheriff's department. Sounds all exciting and high speed / low drag. Nope, not as a medic. I got paid to wait for stuff to happen and sit in the rear with the gear. This being said, my paramedic partner and I both had pistols in the ambulance. As we started approaching the Camaro, my partner shined light around when he says, really low, hushed and rushed, "Back, back, back, now, now, now." He says, I shine my light in the par, and there's intestines wrapped around the gear shifter and a lung in the back seat, so we kind of freaked out. Called dispatch, let them know what's happening, and we are in the process of getting out of there till the cops show up when we see a figure appear walking down the road towards us. As he gets closer, we see he is covered in blood and gore. We both throw on our tactical vests, helmets, snatch our pistols as I sound like a frightened Home Alone 9-year-old on the radio to dispatch. We approach and start screaming at him to get on the ground, which he does. After everyone's heart rate is below 200 beats per minute, we start talking and figure out what happened. This guy had purchased a brand new Camaro and drove it to this desolate stretch of road to open it up. He said 1 minute, he is shifting gears, and the next thing he knows his car is all over the road, and his mouth was full of blood, and it seemed like an explosion had went off. I started looking for injuries all over, and can't really see anything major, and ask him about the passenger in his car. He says, "What passenger?" My partner says, "There's a lung in your back seat." Dude goes straight into mental overload and can't come up with anything, so I'm thinking he's hurt. Get him in the ambulance. Police are 5 minutes away. We potentially have another victim out here. I have to go look by myself. I walk through the crash scene, look into the car, and sure enough, intestines wrapped around the gear shifter, lung in the back seat, looks like part of a liver, looks like a hand grenade went off inside the car. I walk around the other side of the car and see a faint blood smear / stain on the road. Walk to it, see something else further down the road, so I keep walking towards it. I finally see something on the side of the road and run up to it. Honestly, completely freaked out and scared to death about the body I was about to see, and the dude had hit a deer. What happened is when he was winding the car out, state police estimate him well over 100 miles an hour, a deer jumped into his car's pathway and hit the top corner of the windshield with its stomach. When the windshield crashed, it created a negative vacuum in the car, sucking almost all the deer's organs out and into the car and all over him. I had the fire department decontaminate him, wrapped him in some blankets, and took him to the hospital. For many, many years after, my wonderful 911 dispatchers happily played the recording for anyone who wished to hear it. The creep in the woods that underestimated me. I had a summer job when I was a 15-year-old girl that was a few miles from my house. I lived in a rural wooded area, and my parents never let me go into the woods by myself, but they worked days and my job started at noon every day, so I had to walk to work. I chose to disobey them and walk through the woods instead of on the road to work because it cut about a mile off my walk. So every day, at the same time, I'd walk through the very much abandoned state forest down a deer path for a mile or so until intercepted a railroad track. Then I'd walk a couple more miles down the railroad track into town to my job. Stupid, I know, but I was 15. Taking this path always freaked me out, and I always felt like I was being watched, but it was shorter and less sunny and less hot, and so I ignored my instincts, thinking my parents' influence was just making me paranoid. My parents would pick me up after my shift, unaware of my daily routine. This continued for weeks. One day, I'm walking about a mile from any houses, deep in the woods, and there are 2 Corn magazine pages that have been ripped out and placed on the trail facing me. They hadn't been there the day before. I was completely creeped out as they were clearly intentionally placed, and probably for me, since very few people utilize this area, but I kept walking because if I turned around at this point, I'd have to go further to get out of the woods, and then there was a huge hill to climb to get back to my house, and no one would be around there to help me anyways. It was a densely wooded area with brambles and dogwood and rolling hills, so I couldn't see very far in any direction. Suddenly, I could hear someone else walking close by. I stopped, and I would hear them for a split second, and then they would stop. They sounded like they would change in their pocket, so I knew it was an animal, but because of the echo, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Just to check that I wasn't crazy, I stopped once more and heard the same noise, which quickly stopped when I stopped. That's when I knew I was being stalked. My heart was racing with fear and my vision went blurry. My instincts told me not to speak and not to run, but just keep walking down the dense deer path further into the woods. My gut told me not to look behind me. I could sense there was someone right behind me on the deer path now, but I did not look back. Now I'm a rather short, slightly chubby person, always have been, and looking at me you'd probably assume that I couldn't run very fast. So if you wanted to catch me deep in the woods, you might assume you would have a plenty of time to do so. And looking back, I think that is exactly what this creep was thinking. But back then I ran cross country and track and could probably run a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I always placed really well in the hilly terrain. By no means was I a great runner, but certainly I was likely faster than whatever pedo creep was hanging out in the woods stalking a little girl. It's not that I was processing this thought at the time, I just instinctually knew not to run. Yet, I kept walking seemingly deeper into the woods because I knew the train track was up ahead where there would be more space to run without tripping or getting caught in the tree branches. It was terrifying to not look back, but something told me not to. While I walked, I felt like my entire body was shutting down. It's a feeling I've never felt before or after that day. It was the feeling of being prey. Everything went blurry, and I could feel blood pulsing in my ears and my heart was pounding. I just kept walking like nothing was happening and did not turn around, but I felt someone maybe 5 or 10 feet behind me at this point, following me for a good 1/8 of a mile. I didn't turn around. I didn't scream because I knew no one would hear me. As soon as I got near the train tracks, which are elevated along a man-made gravel mound, I ran. And then I ran on all fours up the hill, gripping onto 2 weeds to pull myself up faster, and then I sprinted along the tracks as fast as my lungs and legs could carry me. I heard and saw branches snapping below me in the woods, but now I was out in the sun, and the woods were dark, so I couldn't see what was behind the branches. I just kept sprinting. I never even saw the person, but I knew their intentions were awful. I never cut through the woods again, and I didn't mention what happened to my parents until I was 18, and then moved out of the house. I was too afraid of being grounded. A man in the dark. Hi all, this happened to me about 11 years ago. When walking home from a friend's house at night, I'll just get straight into it. I used to live in a rural part of the UK, and have lived in rural areas most of my life, so I was used to long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never bothered me too much. I get creeped out occasionally, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I ever had. There was this one friend who lived roughly 3 miles away from my house. He had cool parents, and my other friends and I would often go over to his house and play video games and just hang out. Occasionally, this meant walking home at night if I stayed late. There were 2 ways back from my house. The roadway, which was about 5 miles long and took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were very quiet and eerie sometimes, but they were lit by street lamps, so it never bothered me walking this way. The other way was a shortcut through some woods, which took off about 2 miles. And the wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored the wooded shortcut and have probably walked it over 100 times. The woods were dark, however, combined with lack of ambient light due to living in rural areas and yet an absolute abysmal darkness. Luckily, most of the time I had my phone light to walk with, but sometimes my phone would die or the battery would be so low that the flash wouldn't work and I'd have to use my screen light. As you probably guessed by now, this was one of those occasions. I remember my friends and I had just finished watching a film. It was nearing 10 p.m., so we all left my friend's house and headed our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly which way I should go and decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed into the woods. The streetlights dimmed as I entered the fields before the woods. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was really low. Only enough power left for a couple minutes of flash, and then I'd have to use my screen for light. That wouldn't last the whole way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the flash and followed the well-trodden path into the darkness. To my dismay, my life died within seconds of entering, and I flipped my phone over to try and shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for all the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. Funky tree stump, check. Half-fallen fir tree, check. Enormous puddle I had to jump over, check. All was going well. I was halfway through the woods when my phone completely died. I remember the moment it happened. I was engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this level of darkness before, but it was so dark I couldn't even see the outline of my hand centimeters in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed considerably, and I started holding my hand out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued walking for another minute or so, until all of a sudden that pungent smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. I glanced around but couldn't see anything. Then I heard it. A cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods in the dark? Are they following me? Am I lost? I quickened my pace again, throwing a little caution to the wind. I carried on walking and tripped slightly on a branch. As I regained my balance, I heard another sound. Branches breaking underfoot. What sounded like right behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps that grew louder and louder. I started sprinting. I felt the well-trodden path turn to brush. I felt branches, logs and plants hitting my legs. It wasn't long before I fell. Hard. I was lying on the floor, holding my knee. I could still hear branches snapping around me and a voice muttering something. I didn't dare move. Then, all of a sudden, they turned on a torch. I couldn't see anything except for the beam of light which seemed to be eaten quickly by the darkness of the forest. I lay motionless on the ground as the beam swept through the trees. I could still hear the person mumbling a deep growl. The crunching of footfalls grew and grew. They were only several feet away from me at this point. I couldn't breathe. The light went out, the snapping of branches grew, and then, nothing. Quiet. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything. Then I could hear wheezing, right above me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me and I would have known. This carried on for about 5 minutes until the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs started up again and I got fainter and fainter as they moved away from me. I remained lying down for another 5 or 10 minutes, contemplating my escape. Like an idiot, I'd ran off the path and wasn't sure which way back to it or was home. I didn't really care, I thought. I was going to walk in one direction till I left the woods and got home from there. I knew as soon as it started moving again, if the person was still in the woods, they would hear me. Should I run or try and sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings, picked a direction and started walking. I wasn't perfectly quiet, but quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in the distance, and every time I froze, I'd hold my breath until I was happy no one was there, and then start walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity until eventually I found the path. I screamed for joy in my mind and sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes, I saw it. Light. Streetlights filtering in through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see a meager street lamp, but as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart sank. At the end of the path was a black silhouette, unmoving. Contrasted against the light background was a dark figure of a man. What should I do? Maybe it's a different person. Perhaps it's someone walking their dog. I froze and watched them silently, but they didn't move. At all. They just stood there like they were guarding the entrance to the woods. I didn't know what to do. By this point, I'd have enough. I was so close to getting out, I decided to just run straight towards the exit, straight towards them. I was a 6-foot young man. They wanted to stop me, they'd have a hard job of it, I thought. So that's what I did. I started sprinting. The figure grew and grew, and as I reached them, I stepped to the side. I heard someone growl "fuck" loudly and felt something clip the back of my head and tug the back of my jacket. I cleared the sheep gate in one leap and sprinted into the light. I eventually stopped running when I could see the first house and looked back. The entrance to the woods was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing by the entrance. Relaxing a bit more now, I finished my walk home. That's pretty much it. I know I could have overreacted. It could have been someone out for a walk in the woods, a dog walker, camper, but what I thought was strange was that they didn't use their torch except briefly on one occasion. Once they heard me, they also actively seeked me out. Who knows what they would have done if they caught me. In any case, I never walked that way home alone again. Not at night anyways.